Okay. All right. There we go. That's a lot better. So we'll go with that. Good morning. This is our fifth week in our series on Hebrews chapter 11, what we're calling the Hall of Faith, what lots of people might call the Christian Hall of Fame. So this morning for Mother's Day, we're going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. We've been going in order to this point, but we're going to jump ahead to actually the last person who's given their own verse in this chapter to Rahab. So if you'd like to follow along in your Bibles, we'll be in Hebrews 11. We'll be in verses 29, 30, and 31. And we'll also be in Joshua chapter 2. So that's where the story of Rahab is found. We've been in Genesis. We're going to jump forward a little bit to talk about Rahab this morning. So while you're putting your bookmarks there, let's just talk about Rahab and why we're talking about Rahab today. It may seem like an odd Mother's Day topic to pick a story about a prostitute, but hopefully this morning as we unpack her story, as we talk about her story a little bit, maybe more in depth from a different perspective, through a different lens this morning, that we'll get to see that Rahab's story is really the story of every parent in here this morning, of every parent who strives to teach their children in the right way, because her story is one of someone who chose a better future for her family by choosing God. And hopefully, as we unpack this story a little bit this morning, we'll also see that really Rahab's story is all of our stories of outsiders who have regrettable track records, who through the grace of God were taken from being enemies to being family. Her story is our story. And that's why we're going to talk about Rahab this morning for Mother's Day. So Hebrews chapter 11, verses 29 through 31, this is what the word of the Lord says. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army marched around them 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. If you have the NIV, it might have in the margin next to disobedient, unfaithful as the next suggestion for that word. So this is the entry into the Hall of Faith, the Christian Hall of Fame, Hebrews 11 on Rahab. And this morning, as we unpack this story, we'll talk about why we chose to group in two verses about the people of Israel, about their faith, and why she is linked in, grouped in with them, and such an integral part of their story, even though she is not ethnically Jewish. She's not an Israelite. This is the story of Rahab. So we find the story, the main text on Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. We'll read the first 16 verses of Joshua 2 together, and then we'll jump ahead to Joshua 6 to read just 5 verses so that we can see the end of the story, because they go to Jerusalem, they go to Jericho, some other things happen, and then there's the culmination of the Jericho story together. So this is what the word of the Lord says, Joshua chapter 2. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king sent this message to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken 2 men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I do not know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may still catch up with them." But she had taken them up onto the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out of the gates, it was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up to the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us all, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you have completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show me kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother and my brothers and sisters and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." "Our lives for your lives," the men assured her. "If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully. Then the Lord gives us the land." So she let them down a rope through the window, for the house she lived on was part of the city wall. She said to them, "Go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourself there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." So this is the first part, the main part of the story of Rahab, of the spies coming in and seeking it out. So the spies, they go and they hide, they come back. A few other things happen. The Israelites, they have Passover. They come back to Jericho. They march around the walls, right? If you've seen the Veggie Tales, this is where the French Peas sing the, "Keep Walking" song, which is really catchy. But we get to the end of that story, the culmination where the walls are about to fall, in Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 through 25. "When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, 'Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her.' So the young men who had done the spying went and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brother, and her sister, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside of the camp of Israel. When they burned the whole city and everything in it, they put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron into a treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her entire family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day." So this is the story of Rahab, story that we're going to unpack a little bit this morning and talk about why it is that this non-Jewish woman, this outsider from the enemy town, this woman who is synonymous with being a prostitute, is included in the Hall of Faith, included in a chapter where a Jewish author is writing to a primarily Jewish Christian group of people to give them encouragement and hope for the future. So unpacking the story a little bit, the first thing, kind of the elephant in the room that we're not going to sidestep this morning, is that Rahab was a prostitute. It's awkward for us to talk about some of these things, but she was a prostitute. We do know from historical context a few things that can educate, maybe enlighten our position on this story. Firstly, is that in this time period, in this area of Canaan, it would be commonplace for poor families to sell daughters. We also know that, the men came and they stayed at the house of the prostitute. We kind of glance over that sometimes because we don't like maybe some of the implications that are made of God's spies coming into the house of a prostitute. But we also know that it is likely that she may have been something like an innkeeper who had visitors stay in her home often. So she was a prostitute, yes, but she may have been an innkeeper, and it was likely that she was not a prostitute by her own choice. It's been kind of the history of the church, especially of men writing commentaries in the West, to really say very discouraging things about Rahab in their comments on this story, to really kind of drive home the wickedness, as though if we didn't know that being a prostitute was morally bad, as though it was in some sort of moral, ambiguous gray area. This fall, we're going to talk about Hosea. Hosea has a very pointed center message, and that is that God is a faithful husband, and we are prostitutes. So the story of Rahab, as we unpack it, as we address the elephant in the room, we have to put ourselves in the position of a prostitute to fully understand this story. The next thing that we need to kind of unpack about this story is that she received a message from the king. Now, again, we hear these stories and people talk to God and people talk to kings, and it's just kind of a tidbit out of the story, and we brush by it. But you have to remember that this was like everything in her entire world. For so many of us, we travel everywhere, right? We, as Americans, we go on international vacations. We go on vacation thousands of miles away. We go see friends hours and hours away. It's Mother's Day. So this afternoon, my wife and I are going to drive 2.5, maybe 3 hours back to my hometown just to have lunch with my mom and then drive back. We have a big world with lots of things to see, but in that time, for someone like Rahab, her entire world was inside of those city walls. She received a message from the king. Now, none of us have likely ever received a direct personal message from the president of the United States, but it would be a big kind of jarring, pivotal moment in our lives. But in the midst of all of that, of someone of diminished stature in a very small world with big walls built up around her, the one with all the power sends a message to her, and in that moment, she chooses to pledge allegiance to God. One of the things we've been talking about in this series is this idea of faith as seeing with our ears. And we'll unpack that as she gets into what she tells the spies, but in this moment, she demonstrates seeing with her ears. It's not just what everything around her is telling her, it's what she has heard of God. The next detail that we get in the story that we kind of glance over sometimes is that she had stalks of flax laid out on her roof. Now, many of us may not know this because we don't make linens in much the same way they did then, but people who had stalks of flax laid out on their roof were drying them out to make linen. They were in some way, shape, or form an investment. They were like having a savings account. This flax was going to be profitable at some point. This tells us a little bit about her, that she had ambitions of something bigger, that she had things stored away, that she had a plan to make something more of herself than this destitute situation that she was in. She had these flax laid out, being prepared, being dried out to be made into something of value. This is a deeper dive into who Rahab is and why we can identify. You see, her story is very similar to ours. It's very similar to the story of the gospel. We are not Jewish, right? We are not God's chosen people. We are outsiders to the family of God. And we lived and we currently live in a fallen world, right? We chase, because of sin, unfitting and often uncomfortable things to talk about. We chase after our desires that are not things that we would bring up at family dinner. Many of us in our lives, we've chased after things that we don't want to talk about. I've mentioned this before, but one of the main reasons why adults don't work with youth groups in their churches is because they don't want to talk to teenagers about who they were when they were teenagers. They want to stay away from the story of kind of all the things they did in their past. That's kind of gross, if we're being honest. Morally detestable, some of the things that we're not really proud of. That God says, look, in him, it's as far as the east is from the west, but yet for us, we just kind of don't want to talk about it. But much like Rahab, God reaches out through the chaos, through the muck, through the grime. We hear of him and we see light breaking through. We see something bigger. Rahab heard of what God had done, heard that he split the Red Sea, that he dried it up, that they wiped out the Ammonites, that he did all of these things. She had this small little world with built up walls and a set place, which is very low. And yet then she heard the good news of this mighty God who was coming. And she said, I want to be a part of that. I want something bigger. Everything that her eyes told her was, do what the king says. Don't cause waves. But she heard the good news of God. And with that, she had vision of something bigger. This is faith. That we might hear the message of God, the truth of a love story of a God who is bigger than the forces and the powers and the principalities of this world. And that he is coming and welcoming us. So unpacking this story a little bit, we continue to see that just like last week with Noah, she demonstrates holy fear of God, right? She says that God is serious. God is something and someone to be taken seriously. She says that all of the cities were afraid of them. Everyone heard and their hearts melted. They were terrified of this great force coming their way. And we can all say that, yes, we have a holy fear of God. We have an earnest understanding of God's authority, but she had a make or break moment. There was a conflict between an earthly power and her faith in this higher power. She was called upon personally by the king to do something, and she chose holy fear and allegiance to God. See, she heard the stories and she responded in faith. This is what she said. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. This is a big thing. It's a big thing to say because for many of these small countries and tribes of that time, they believed in kind of regional or local gods, a god of the mountains, a god of the harvest, right? Baal was supposed to be a god that brought fertility and great farming, a god of the seas. But rarely ever this kind of language of your God is the God of everything up there and everything down here. He is the big G, Elohim of Elohims. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. That's a big statement. That's a big statement that if we're honest with ourselves, there are days we wake up and that's not a statement that's at the forefront of our minds. Because we make other things gods. We make ourselves gods. But in this moment, when she's faced with probably the biggest presence of earthly power that she's ever experienced in the king himself, or likely, a page or a squire of the king coming with a direct message from the king. She says, you may be the king, but he is the God of heaven above and of earth below. She turns to them and she says, then now, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family. To my family. Now, times have changed a lot since this story happened, but they haven't changed so much so that if you were a prostitute, you probably had an odd family dynamic. There probably was some some things you didn't talk about. But this is not a woman who, as so many of our kind of narrow commentators have put out before, is kind of this selfish, deplorable woman. I mean, we all lived in darkness and chased our desires apart from Christ. But now, having heard of God, having heard the gospel and reaching out in faith to God, she turns her heart outwards towards her family and says, show kindness to them, to my parents, to my siblings, to everyone who belongs to them. This is why this is a Mother's Day sermon. This is a Mother's Day sermon because it's all about a faithful future. Rahab had decided that God was the best choice for a better future for her family. Right? She was not a wife or a mother yet, but this decision would ultimately change those things. It would lead to a good and a bright future for her family. Without that decision, she would have been wiped out. Her family would have been wiped out with everyone else in Jericho. There is no future for her family apart from God. But she says God is the best path forward. While the rest of the city is laughing and saying, you'll never penetrate our walls, keep walking around the outside of our walls. We are mighty Jericho. She, in the face of the king, says he is the God of heaven and he is the God of earth. She places her faith in a faithful future in the hands of a faithful God. This is the goal of biblical parenting. A faithful future in the hands of a faithful God. Now, we know it's been a rough year. It's been a very hard year. But the path forward is trust in God. But that path is so hard to see sometimes. We know from our own polls, our own studies, our own asking questions of ourselves that most parents really feel like they, in some way, shape, or form, dropped the ball this last year. Yes, lots was expected of them. It was a very difficult year. But they just feel like, man, I don't know. I just feel like I'm not doing a very good job. The expectations are maybe really high. I'm not living up to all of these things, and we start to calculate all of these things. We start to condemn ourselves, but what we need to remember is that the job of every parent is for a hope and a faithful future in the hands of a faithful God. Your job is only ever to the best of your fallen and broken abilities, point them towards the God who desires to give them the best possible future, which is fellowship with him. It's been a rough year, but we must trust in God. That is the path forward. That is the story of Rahab. Unpacking this story a bit farther with another detail that maybe we don't always talk about so much. She sent them to the hills, which are to the west, for the king's men were heading back towards the Jordan River, which was to the east. So while this is smart, this was clever, this was a good plan by her, the spies had to trust her. They had to trust her to go not only away from their camp, but farther in to the land of the Canaanites. They were spies. She said, look, you're going to have to go deeper into the lion's den and hang out there for 3 days to be safe. But because they saw the earnest faith that she had in their God, they put their trust in her. See, Joshua 6:25 says, but Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. That last line really shows the impact of the story of Rahab. You see, next week, as we continue through Hebrews 11, we'll talk about Abraham, kind of the big guy of the Old Testament. If there's an Old Testament Rushmore, right, it's Abraham, Moses, Elijah, and King David. But Abraham is the father of the people of Israel. He's, Father Abraham. He was promised a few things in his covenant with God, which we'll talk about next week. But he was promised land. And in this story, we see them starting to take that land that is promised to them. But he was also promised that his people, his descendants, would be blessed to bless the nations. You see, this is why Rahab is so important. This is why she, as an outsider, as a non-Jewish person, as a woman, as a prostitute, is brought in as such a powerful sign and symbol and foretaste. Because she is the first Canaanite convert. In the midst of them taking this land that was promised to them, she is a glimpse forward to the people of Israel that God will bless them, that they might bless other nations. That they are not just this little club of people with their own personal God who's going to come in and they're going to take this land and they're going to be their own little happy society and put up walls, but that God is going to bless them to bless other people. That the glory of the Lord will be heard by other people and that they might come to know him as well. Rahab is the first convert of the Canaanite people. And she becomes family. She went from being the enemy to family. This is the story of Rahab. This is her importance, but this is a foretaste of us, of the story of the gospel, of the bigger picture of God's love. As the Apostle Paul tells us, we were enemies to God. Not that he saw us in that way, but that we were enemies to him and his will and his vision. And we went from enemies to family. She went from a lowly prostitute in an enemy village that they were spying on to being part of the family, to living amongst them, to being one of them. This is her story. This is our story. Now, the book of Matthew, it's the most Jewish of all of the Gospels, right? Matthew is writing to a very Jewish audience, a lot of Old Testament references in Matthew. You really got to know your Old Testament to really understand all the kind of clever things that Matthew does. So he starts off by walking us through this genealogy that starts with Abraham and takes us all the way to ultimately Joseph, the father of Jesus, in Jesus. But in the middle there, we get this. Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So in the list, a long list that takes up a whole first chapter of Matthew that says, here is the father, and here is the firstborn son, and then here is the name of the firstborn son of that firstborn son. And then that firstborn son is this guy's firstborn. And it keeps going and just kind of listing dads and firstborns for the most part, right? With a few kind of exceptions in there. In the middle, we get Rahab. Right in the middle of a Jewish-leaning gospel, we get Rahab. Included in this list. In this entire list, we only get the name of 4 women, right? Tamar, much earlier in the list, and then Rahab, Ruth, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And out of even those 4, only 2 of them are not Israelites, Rahab and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. In the middle of all of this story of God's people, right, from Father Abraham to King David, who's only a few generations removed from Rahab, and then all the way down to Jesus, we get these names of these 2 women who are not Israelites. So not only are they women named in the genealogy, they are non-Israelite women named in the genealogy. Rahab's son, Boaz, plays a bigger role later in the Old Testament in the story of Ruth. As we see, it's a reversal of sorts. His mother is a non-Israelite who's brought in to the family. Marries Solomon, has Boaz, and then Boaz in return, as now the insider, where his mom was the outsider, takes Ruth and brings her into the family of God. Rahab is included by name in the genealogy of the one who came to graft all of us into the family of God. Rahab is included by name by a Jewish author, not only in Hebrews 11, and not only in Matthew 1, but also in James 2. So James, a figure, a leader in the early church in Jerusalem, is writing this letter. Famously, the letter of James is about faith without works being dead. And in making that case about people who acted upon their faith, we've used the terminology active trust or also allegiance. He uses Rahab as an example. James chapter 2, verses 24 through 26. This is what the word of the Lord says. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Rahab included into this big story. Rahab, multiple times by Jewish men writing to other Jews, includes her into this story. So this is the one big thing. The one thing that we need to take away. If you take away nothing else, take away this. Our circumstances may seem hopeless. We may feel like failures because that's what sin does. This has been a rough year. If you are a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a mentor, and you feel like you've had a strained relationship with a young person, like maybe you're not doing everything you should be for that young person, remember that your job is only ever to point them back towards the God who desires them. As we said at the end of the statement, for the God who desires to give us his track record, his family, and his love. It's been a hard year. It's been one of those years where we can say, yes, I believe this. I have that faith. But as James says, faith without the works or faith without the follow through, without the allegiance, is just ideology. In those big make or break moments, we have to have that understanding that God desires to give us his track record, his family, and his love. This has been a year of broken relationships, of rethinking a lot of things, and I would be lying to you this morning if I didn't say that at least twice in this last year have I sat down and gone, am I supposed to be a pastor? Is it supposed to be this hard? Have I wasted years and tons of money on school? Have I wasted all of my adult life to this point pursuing a calling that simply is not working out because it should not be this hard? But God desires to give us his track record, his family, and his love. Not our track record of all of our failures. Not our track record with all of the things that we don't want to talk about. His track record, his family, his love. Our circumstances may seem hopeless. We talked about Habakkuk earlier this year and how he cried out to God and he said, look, God, it's like the righteous are being hemmed in on all sides by the wicked. Where is the hope? How much longer, Lord? But God desires to give us his track record, his family, and his love. This is why the author of Hebrews wrote this chapter, to remind us of all the stories of faith, to remind us of all of the different times when all we could see with our eyes was the world closing in on us because that's what sin does. But how we are called to be a people who hear the truth of God and see with our eyes. So the one big thing is that our circumstances will at times seem bleak. Having hope, having faith does not mean having no hard seasons, having no real kind of faith-shaking moments or seasons of life. But when we can see with our ears, we remember and we are reminded that God desires to give us his track record, his faith, and his love. not our falling short, our things that we're ashamed of, our things that we don't want to talk about, our broken relationships, his love, his family, his track record. So we like to ask ourselves, so what? What do we do with this passage? What do we do with this story? How do we apply it? The first thing is plain and simple. We proclaim gospel often and even to each other. You see, sometimes it's difficult to just say, like, I'm going to present the gospel even up here on a Sunday morning, knowing that, most of you have heard it dozens, hundreds of times. We're like, yeah, we've heard the story, but the truth of the matter is that we need reminders of the goodness of God and that his promises hold true. Right? We will have a track record of regrettable actions. It is something that's going to happen. We are going to fall flat on our face. We are going to do things that we should not do. We are going to mess up. If you are a parent here this morning, the story of Rahab should tell you this. When you feel like you've failed your kids, are you pointing them to a God who is more faithful than you? Are you pointing them to a God who is more faithful than anything in this world makes even sense for him to be? Your job is only ever to do that. It's not to hold this track record. It's of yourself. It's not to have a win and loss column, to look back on this past year where lots of things were thrown at you and go, man, if I could have done it all over again, I would have done this, I would have done this, I would have done this. We are covered by grace. So if you are a parent this morning, I feel for you. I cannot empathize with you. I don't know what it is to be a parent, but we must remember this. We will have a track record of regrettable actions. You will let yourself down, and you will probably, let your children down. But God is faithful. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. He is the best option for a better future. Will that mean that if you do what you're supposed to do, that it's just going to take, and that all of us are going to have kids that are well-adjusted Christian adults? No, that's not what it means. But it means that your job is to simply keep telling them the story, keep loving them, keep living out that allegiance to God, to them, and telling them the same thing over and over and over again. That even when the walls are closing in on us, even when lots is asked of us, even when we falter and we fail, still God is faithful. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. He is the best option for a better future. That is a story of Rahab. That is a story of parents. That is a story of each and every one of us. From enemy to family, God reaches out to us. Will you pray with me?